Thank you for joining us. My name is Jennifer Brandt, and I'm the director of the Innovation Council, which is a cross-sectoral innovators group based in Geneva, Switzerland. We're organizing this session together with our partner Bobob in Africa, which is a streaming and networking platform bringing together Africa-focused science, technology, and business experts. So we're really grateful to be co-hosting this discussion today with them. We've got three great speakers, and I think without further ado, we can jump right into a discussion around biomanufacturing and looking specifically about different ways companies, governments, and other actors are working to expand biomanufacturing production capacity in emerging regions. We'll have somewhat of a focus on Africa today. So I'd like to start by introducing one of our speakers, Anissa Boomlik. She's director and head of the strategy operationalization group within the bioprocessing strategy and process solutions unit of Merck Life Science. I'm a little sick today, so bear with me. Merck Life Science is part of the Merck Darmstadt group, and Anissa has more than 10 years experience in the industry, working primarily in the fields of viral safety, vaccines, and gene therapy manufacturing. Within Merck Life Science, she's working to make sure the business's offerings really match the needs of customers, of biomanufacturing customers. She'll explain more about that later. She's on several boards, and she is a biotech engineer by training. And she holds a PhD degree in molecular and cellular biology combined with biochemistry and biotechnology. So handing over to Anissa, Anissa, if you could open the floor, explain to us a little bit, just to set the stage, what does Merck Life Science do within global value chains? What role does the company play in vaccines and other biologics manufacturing?
Thank you, Jennifer, for the very kind introduction. So the life science division of Merck KGaA is offering, is partnering and supporting multiple entities, whatever, if they're in research or if they are in biomanufacturing or even institutions, to advance at the end the development and productions of biomolecules, so biologicals in particular. And how this division is working is, obviously there are products and services that are dedicated to that, whatever, if it's from the bench scale up to the industrial manufacturing. But we also do have expertise. We have a number of engineers and scientists that also work hand in hand with other scientists on the other side, providing the technology and support to advance that process. There's also other aspects also that we are involved. So we have our own as well contract manufacturing organization who's dedicated to the outsource, like when companies needs to outsource manufacturing of biologicals, whatever, if it's monoclonal antibodies, viral vector for gene therapy as an example. We do have as well services for testing, like for all control and testing before releasing a drug. You need to go through a number of testing. So that's also something which we have within the life science. And we also do support like facility design and engineering in general. So how do we fit within the overall ecosystem is really about not only a technology, sometimes what we refer to technology provider or technology solution provider. So this is how we fit. But not only that, we also do actively participate in several partnerships and collaborations, in particular to advance biomanufacturing, and we will talk about it, but also vaccine, because we think that it's part of the role of also a technology provider to take part of that and contribute to sustainable manufacturing.
Just a follow-on question, listening to what you're saying, how do you work with governments, for example? Can you give us an example?
Sure. So we do not we don't have necessarily a direct relationship with governments. So unless if an institute or a company that is government owned will develop or manufacture a certain biological, so that's kind of the relationship that we can. It's more like, I would say, a provider to customer relationship. But what we're trying to do is more be part of an ecosystem, right? So it's really about how making sure also that we can provide know-how or considerations for projects or that are supported by governments. So we are involved in certain collaborations or coalitions, if you want, where we also bring that angle, which is more like the industry angle that can help governments as well understand what are the challenges they might face in establishing such an endeavor or projects of biomanufacturing in a given country. So that's where we are mainly positioned. And what we do is that we will partner with those that are really developing in manufacturing and can help them as well in positioning their project to governments to get more support or to get more visibility.
So, okay, against that backdrop, what would you say is the state of play in global biomanufacturing? And specifically, maybe if you could comment on which regions are doing particularly well, what are the trends you're seeing, and why are those regions in the lead?
Sure, Jennifer. So first of all, if we look at the global, in particular human biopharmaceutical, this is a highly growing market, right? I think we're about $270 billion business, and it's going to continue to grow at a very high single digit and sometimes double digit for particular segments. For example, oncology or gene therapy, those are highly growing sectors. I would say that until maybe 10, 15 years ago, most of this market was driven by North America and Europe, right? So which was dominating this market. But in the last decade and a little bit more, what we qualify as growing markets or low and middle income countries in general have made a really great progress, in particular led by China and India. We are expecting to see even higher growth from those countries. And therefore, they have been able to strengthen their manufacturing for vaccines and monoclonal antibody for oncology in the countries. What we see is, in general, definitely Asia is growing faster, and not only China and India. We see as well now Southeast Asia and other countries such as South Korea that are also looking into strengthening their manufacturers and have highly grown as well. Whatever if it's for outsourcing or if it's for local manufacturing, and what we can see is that Latam and Africa is a little bit, I would say, have still the lowest manufacturing infrastructure, but there are programs and we see initiatives that are going to happen that will allow to increase that level of manufacturing. So I think in general, all regions are looking to strengthen their manufacturing, whatever it's within high income country or low and middle income countries. And we see that the gap is being reduced over the years between these two words.
Thanks for that. So I'm going to call next on Simon Aguale, who also has a PhD, this time in virology and vaccinology, with over 20 years of experience working in academic institutions, founding a biotech startup, publishing in peer-reviewed academic journals. Simon's on several boards, and here he's representing the African Vaccine Manufacturing Initiative. So Simon, why don't we start by explaining, if you could explain a little bit about AVMI and tell us about the collective experience of the membership.
Well, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk about AVMI. AVMI stands for African Vaccine Manufacturing Initiative. And AVMI started bringing together African vaccine manufacturers and other groups in 2010 with the goal of building African capacity to develop its own vaccines. Membership cut across vaccine manufacturers, so vaccine manufacturers on the continent are members of AVMI, and also scientists from universities and research institutes that are working on vaccine-related areas, and representatives of regional health organizations like the West African Health Organization, the SADC, the OSIAC, and so on. So our mission basically is to promote the establishment of sustainable human vaccine manufacturing capacity in Africa And then AVMI has 4 task teams that are responsible for the implementation of its plans. And this include the advocacy task team, the communications, the vaccine technologies, and finance.
Okay, so really representing all different kinds of actors in this vaccine ecosystem in Africa. The common thread is everybody in Africa in that area. So drawing on this collective experience, can you tell us about some recent successes? What some examples of projects in Africa that you'd like to highlight and tell us a little bit about in biomanufacturing?
Yeah, we know that COVID-19 has accelerated the amount of technology transfers initiated on the continent from just 3 before 2020. And the 3 basically were all in South Africa. And then to now over 10 announcements since 2020. And these include announcements from Pfizer, where they are partnering with BioVac to produce at least 100 million doses of their vaccine in South Africa. And all that is expected to be used on the continent. Then you have the Johnson & Johnson, with Aspen, and also in South Africa you have, the BioNTech in Senegal, Rwanda, and then again you have the CIDA, Nigeria, and Sputnik V, and then you have the mRNA hub also in South Africa, and finally you have the innovative biotech and Merck KGA. So most of these initiatives today are centered on fill-finish operations, and for sustainability, we must start focusing on upstream drug substance manufacturing. And we have a typical case study. And the reason we single this out is because both parties, Innovative Biotech, Merck, also on this panel, where we are not only working on the fill-finish side, but the entire value chain. That is the end-to-end, starting from making the vaccines, purifying the vaccines, and then doing the fill and finish operations, and using COVID vaccine as the entry point, where the entire project started with the R&D, making the vaccine, and then alongside developing the process for making the vaccines, designing the facility, and then building the facility.
So you mentioned that there had been 3 tech transfers before 2020, and then a plethora of announcements, at least since then. Are all of these focused on different areas of the manufacturing process?
Yes, the good thing about, the previous tech transfers, that is before 2020, they were all downstream process or fill-finish operations. But with the COVID, it's a mix. You have both the upstream, which is the production of the drug substance, and then the downstream, which is the fill-finish operations. So if you look at all the announcements made, you see that the BioNTech, Senegal, Rwanda is looking more into the upstream process, not only for COVID, but they are looking to use that technology to also make malaria vaccine. And then most of the other initiatives, like the Vaxera and the Recipam, Sotema announcements in Morocco, they are designed initially for fill-finish and then backward integration. But the 2 clear-cut upstream drug substance manufacturing announced, number 1 is the mRNA hub. Of course, the announcement that is going on, they look to conducting the clinical trials of the vaccine that they have made this year, and then the announcement by Innovative Biotech and Merck, where they make specifically VLP-based COVID-19 vaccine, incorporating different variants, Beta, Delta, Omicron, and then advancing that to clinical trials. And then alongside that, building facility on the continent where this vaccine and other VLP-based vaccines will be produced.
Okay, so this raises some questions for me for Anissa, going back to Anissa for a second. So Simon's just raised a lot of different examples of things that are happening across Africa in all different regions. So how would you define success of a venture to extend biomanufacturing capacity, like based on what metrics? And can you tell us a couple of the stories maybe of some of these projects, you know, how they start, what are some of the factors driving success and where you see them going?
Sure. So I think if we want to look at the continental level, and I think this is also what the Africa CDC and Africa Union through the PAVM, the Partnership for African Vaccine Manufacturing Initiative, is about, is to look at the percentage of biologicals, and in particular here vaccine, is manufactured in the continent. So while today, like Simon was mentioning as well, we have limited production, which is less than 1%. The success that is defined, the metrics that has been defined by this continental strategy is to have as a minimum 60% of production of vaccine in the continent. So that's what we are aiming at, that's the goal, and that what is considered to be a success. And that is for 2040. So it's quite I would say, some years to reach that milestone. And maybe we could reach it earlier, we'll see. And then after, you need to kind of do like a retro planning of all the milestones that are needed, right? And that is what is about the framework has been defining, that there are multiple steps that Africa needs to be at in order to reach that objective. And if we want to look at maybe the early signs of success, is unfortunately fortunately have been fostered by COVID pandemic, and it was, I think, a catalyst. But one first sign of success is to start seeing technology transfers and partnerships. And I think what we have seen before COVID was between Sanofi, Pfizer, and BioVac was already considered to be a success in the continent, because it was the first time that there was a partnership with international vaccine companies and a local company in Africa. But then what we will see next is how this model can be a bit more sustainable. And that's what Simon was mentioning. From the next step of success is when you have production of the full biological, from upstream to downstream to filling in the continent. And we already see that in Egypt for monoclonal antibodies, and we also see that also for certain vaccines, such as in Senegal. But there is definitely a need to ramp up that, and I think the next kind of milestones as well is to see as well the establishment of a local ecosystem around that, which governments putting in place the right regulatory pathway, the right incentive for manufacturers, the right access to the market for manufacturers. And we have started to see that as well in certain countries, that allows the manufacturers to feel that there is a de-risk. You know, they're investing, but they know that they will have access to market. That's the example of South Africa. And hopefully that's what we will see as well in the other countries that Simon has mentioned. And that, I think, is for me also another success criteria, is when you have all the elements around that allow to make that venture into biologicals easier. Other elements as well, besides regulatory market access, that we can consider as a success or metrics, is as well the trade barriers that needs to be changed. We know today that this is also more difficult for countries within the continent to freely exchange. So that, and in particular, if we are starting to look at the scale that is needed to make this as a sustainable business, you need to have access to more than just your country as a market. So there are those elements that also will have to be changing. And there's a lot of infrastructure in general in Africa, projects that will help that as well. So like obviously the Africa Trade projects, and as well as the African Regulatory Agency. So all this will also be considered, even though it's not directly linked with biomanufacturing, but those will also be successes criteria and milestones that will help to reach that target.
So looking also then at shaping the regulatory environment, the policy environment for doing business in these areas. Okay, so that creates an opening to bring in Professor Mark Schultz, I'll introduce briefly, is the Goodyear Endowed Chair in Intellectual Property Law and Director of the IP and Technology Law Program at the University of Akron School of Law in the US. So Mark is a consultant to many different organizations on a range of IP matters, ranging from patents to trade secrets and copyright, OECD, WIPO, USPTO, Government of India, and others. And he has just published a new study last year about IP and COVID. So maybe to open, Mark, I'd like to ask you about the key findings of your research, that report.
Yes, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and to learn from my colleagues on the panel. So I think one of our most important findings was that intellectual property was not a barrier, but was more of a facilitator at every necessary step in innovation to fight the COVID pandemic. It was a facilitator in creating technology platforms like mRNA, designing the vaccines, and manufacturing. And why was it a facilitator? Because certainly property rights, of course, create exclusivity, but they also foster investment and create the necessary environment for collaboration. And I guess this leads to another finding that's related. We found a really large extent of distributed innovation, and that distributed innovation at every step required collaboration. In other words, different actors had different parts of the solution, and they needed to work together to accomplish the result. So when we look at technology platforms, for example, mRNA, there were many parents to that technology. You could go back as far as, if you really want to go back to the discovery of mRNA in the early 60s, but the research in university labs by people like Dr. Kathleen Carrico and others created the key components that allowed this to potentially become a practical technology. But then the private sector picked up that technology, often licensed in the form of patents, into startups that then invested billions of dollars and many years of applied research to create the mRNA technology platforms that were fortunately ready by the time we needed them. And those included companies like BioNTech and Moderna. The development of the COVID vaccines also required a lot of collaboration and investment. And that was an example of that is the Pfizer BioNTech collaboration. They had to work together, and intellectual property created the environment of trust they needed to share some of their most proprietary technology. And indeed, the manufacturing of COVID vaccines required collaboration. And we found, for example, over 40 manufacturing agreements for the 5 leading vaccines. We were able to find those in the public record by the end of last summer. And they were global. On every continent, essentially, there were collaborations like Simon described for fill and finish, but also for major production of key components of the vaccines. And some of these collaborations were with natural and historical competitors to Pfizer, to AstraZeneca, and others. They had to work with some of their biggest competitors. They could not have done that without an environment of trust. So we were, I think, just surprised by the level and depth of collaboration, how many different parties brought different pieces of the solution together. We learned how much biomanufacturing is an increasingly innovative and not only an innovative activity, but an innovative activity where many different parties bring different pieces of the solution, and they all have their own IP. This isn't just vertical with one company that has, develops the technology, develops the manufacturing capacity, et cetera. This often requires many parties to come together for a solution. And so the extent to which IP was facilitating these relationships was notable.
Okay, so we had Simon who listed quite a number of different partnerships with multinational companies, big innovators, very well known now, especially after the COVID pandemic, with local partners. So what you're saying is that IP is an important part of the environment that lets these partnerships happen and thrive. What kinds of IP rights are we talking about? Can you give a little bit more insight into what that actually means to be sharing IP and collaborating using IP?
Well, certainly. I think there are usually, initially there are patented technologies that often that are developed in the course at research institutes. And these are usually the initial building blocks of a technological platform. And for those building blocks to be taken and turned into practical solutions and commercialized requires a lot of investment. So usually they're patented and either licensed out or transferred to, say, a startup or a larger company that then, because of the confidence they have in the patents they have, are likely to develop the technology further. As I said, it took another decade after the basic building blocks of mRNA technology were created. Took another decade of applied research and commercialization to get to the point where we were able to develop vaccines. Another essential form of IP are trade secrets. The trade secrets cover the proprietary information that's developed in the research and development process. The things that aren't yet inventions, maybe never will be inventions because they're dead ends, but even knowing what's a dead end is valuable information. But more point, all the important milestones in the way to developing the solution. As you do that R&D, and as you collect information about the function of of a particular therapeutic or vaccine, and then you develop proprietary manufacturing techniques and the like, all of these things can be protected by trade secrets. And I think sometimes we worry that secrets secrets have a bad reputation to some extent, but we should remember that trade secrets are a little different from secrets. Trade secrets are legal protection for proprietary information that companies hold close, but the law protects them as opposed to protecting them by not telling anybody. Trade secrets allow you to expand the circle of trust as long as you get the agreement of others to keep that information proprietary. You can share them. And that's, for example, what Pfizer has done in expanding its manufacturing capacity, working with manufacturing partners there. It's been documented. Pfizer has turned over, thousands of pages of proprietary information, many dozens, perhaps hundreds of things they consider trade secrets, all with the understanding and the protection of trade secret law that have enabled them to expand manufacturing capacity worldwide using trade secrets.
Okay, so linking this back to some of these collaborations that we heard from Simon and Anissa about. Simon, let me ask you a question. Tell me a little bit more about what Mark has just been talking about know-how and the role of knowledge and know-how, and how is that being shared as through some of these technology transfer partnerships in either direction, I guess, towards the local partner, from the local partner back to the multinational?
Well, I mean, before I answer that, it's important to mention some of the challenges that the local manufacturers are having because there's this general hesitancy of vaccine manufacturers to engage in technology transfers because of the high investments in staff development, in equipment procurement, and then the facility enhancement. So basically technology transfers, I mean, like what Mark laid down, from experienced manufacturers to local manufacturers, we help to bridge this skill gap by transferring the technologies and know-how from the experienced manufacturer to local manufacturer. That's how it goes. That's how it is. So the trade secrets, the patent waivers, and so on, they are good, but without the know-how, there's no way this technology, this is going to happen. So I think that what Mark said is the right approach. We have to do that, and then we can get those technologies by partnerships from the experienced manufacturers, because any partnership, it should be a win-win. Both parties win, the receiver, the giver win, and then it becomes a successful partnership. Then government has a role to play. The government has to create the enabling environment, and then they have to provide some incentives, like the advanced purchase commitments, access to market, innovative financings. All these strategies we have to de-risk the investment.
That's an interesting point. I'd like to ask Anissa about that, actually. Anissa, you also had mentioned market shaping. I think that's kind of what Simon's getting at. Can you comment also on that point, the need for intervention in that way?
Sure. I think what Simon mentioned is when maybe I can share maybe some historical, there was some history as well in certain countries, that there are certain private companies that decided to venture into biologicals in the past. And what happened is that, again, going back to that economy of scale, that obviously it is very difficult to compete if you are producing small quantities of a biological. You basically are able to have a better return on investment on large volumes. But when you start, you usually start small, right? But if you're, so what happened with insulin in the past is that certain companies have tried to make locally insulin in different countries, Africa, Middle East, and other countries as well in other geographies. And what happened is that when the market is completely open, obviously and if these are all tender-based procurements, and obviously any external company can come and because this company will have a large production footprint and will allow to have maybe better prices. So what happened is that then it becomes very difficult for a small company that is trying to raise in this field to be competitive, right? So different countries will have different policies. There are countries in Africa that have decided to close the market or to dedicate a certain number of the market to companies that are manufacturing locally. That's what we call national preference, right? And that's not new. China have done this for a long time, is that you guarantee to a number of your companies in the country a certain percentage of the market so that they can also continue to produce, to ensure sustainability. And that is what I think, what we call as well advanced purchase commitment. And advanced purchase commitment is maybe more specific to vaccines, right? Because that also, we know that with vaccines, there's also some national security. So as a government, you want to make sure you will have production of a certain number of vaccines. So you will in advance agree with the manufacturer. So not only you give him access to the market, but you also making sure you have access to the vaccine. So there's also that relationship with the manufacturer. Those commitments is not something new. We know that, for example, in the past, Gavi was doing this with certain companies. They were agreeing on access to a certain number of vaccine lots, which was securing as well the market. Because as a company, you also want to make sure that this is something viable for you. So those are the type of processes and policies that are in place to ensure a sustainable production and supply of biologicals.
I'm going back to Simon for a second. So building on what Nisa's just said, go back a little bit to some of the challenges that you see in this area, especially in Africa, in terms of extending biomanufacturing infrastructure. You ran quickly through a couple of them, but I just liked if you could spell out maybe 2 or 3 of them as illustrative examples and give us an idea of how those might be addressed. That could be interesting.
Well, I mean, the first is the initial investment. This is a huge challenge because the initial investment is huge. You need, at least $50 million to $100 million to set up a mini manufacturing facility, and this is not going to be ready in a year or two, and then you have to develop your staff along the line. You have to recruit staff, train them, and so on. So that huge gap, investment is very risky for local manufacturers to undertake. So we see that as the main risk, and that creates a hesitancy of vaccine manufacturers to engage in technology transfer. So we think that the solution, like what the Anissa said, is basically to find a way of providing innovative financing that will cover this risk, because without that happening, there's no way that we can get to where we're going. So that is the main challenge that we have seen with the manufacturers on the continent. The IP is not an issue. There are, of course, different ways that this can be addressed. We can always license in technologies like what Mark mentioned. Or alternatively, depending on the technology that we're talking about, we can design around. But the interesting thing is that most of the vaccines that are currently in use on the continent are out of patent. So patents shouldn't be a barrier to entry. So we should focus more on the know-how, because even if these waivers are granted, how are you going to do it if you don't have the know-how? So I think we should focus more on the know-how rather than focusing basically on IP waivers. Over.
Okay, so interesting. So you mentioned risk. I guess risk is something that we could also relate back to IP, Mark. What do you see as some of the, would you consider, for example, a patent and IP waiver as something that might be perceived as risky, that could slow tech transfer? What's your opinion maybe around some of these waiver proposals or other risks associated perhaps with sharing proprietary technology and know-how, as you mentioned?
Well, the waiver proposals would allow governments to suspend IP rights or somehow attempt to require transfer know-how. And I think that certainly creates a more risky environment. I think first we have to think about how new innovative technologies get developed. Biologics are not like small molecule drugs that are made by a fairly well-known process, are synthesized by a fairly well-known process and manufactured by a fairly well-known process. Each of these new biological treatments have represented a new step in technology, and they've required a lot of investment from the very beginning. And that investment isn't going to occur if the potential investors think that they could lose their investment. BioNTech and Moderna were startups, and just not so long ago. Moderna was founded around 2010, for example, with billions of dollars of other people's money. And those investors aren't going to decide to avoid investing out of spite. They won't forego investment because of the IP waiver. Because the IP waiver makes them angry. They'll forego investment because things like an IP waiver make it more risky. Anytime you invest in a biologic, you have to accept that your investment's likely going to fail. Most potential treatments don't come to fruition. Most companies don't succeed, but you accept that when you invest. What you can't accept is that if you succeed, your investment will also be taken from you. Then there's no upside. And so you choose to invest elsewhere. That's the problem. The money goes elsewhere. It goes somewhere safer, somewhere less productive for humanity. It goes into lifestyle brands or food and beverages instead of risky bio startups. And then later on in the process, companies have to make choices about whether to respond to, say, a global health crisis, and they may have to look back on, what happened the last time. And they are health companies. They are driven by profit, but they are also mission driven. So they're likely to still try to address the next global health crisis in some way, but they also have responsibilities to their shareholders. And they have to and their employees, and they can't give away their technology. So what they may do is collaborate less. They may go slower, more carefully, hold things more closely, not collaborate with manufacturers in jurisdictions that they find risky because they've waived IP rights. And that's, I think, the risk, is that we naturally get less investment and less collaboration and less commitment to solving a problem, not out of spite, but out of the logic of needing to protect investments. The last thing I'll say is one venture capitalist once pointed out to me, he said, "I love investing in this sector. I feel like I'm doing something good." He said, "But I also I'm not investing my own money. I usually have to raise a fund of investment. And some of that money is pension money." He says, I'm raising money from pension funds and I'm risking people's pension money. And I can't risk it in good conscience, people's pensions, on things that could be taken away. So, yes, there's capitalism here. Yes, there's a profit motive, but it's more complicated. People have responsibilities, and because of that, we'll suppress innovation and collaboration if we waive IP rights.
So really getting a delicate balance here in terms of making sure that people are able to invest and recuperate the fruits of that investment. Question for you, Anissa. So we've looked at a lot of the challenges in the space. Tell me now about, where can we get some optimism here? Like, what are the strengths of the vaccine manufacturers and other actors in Africa in particular? Like, what are we building on, and how are they contributing potentially to some of the longer term regional or global goals?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So first of all, there is already a foundation. It's not like we're starting everywhere and everything from scratch. So there is already a pharmaceutical industry that is, there is a foundation, in particular in certain countries like Morocco, Egypt, but also we mentioned South Africa, Senegal, etc., etc. So there's those manufacturers that used to be more in the classical pharma, and Mark was mentioning before, yes, small molecules is not like biologicals. But we've seen that evolution from moving from or adding to the small molecule production and knowledge and know-how, as well going to the biologicals. What is the benefit here and the strength is that there is already an existing infrastructure, there is already a regulated market. Some countries are already exporting on the classical pharma side for other highly regulated market. So there is already that relationship and that experience which can help to move towards biologicals. And we have seen that, for example, certain countries were able to do filling of biologicals, even though historically they were producing small molecules, because that was sharing a lot of similarity. So that is one thing. Second, we mentioned that earlier, but COVID-19 acted as a catalyst. So the strength that we see is that there are certain countries that have immediately developed a strategy with a longer term goal. So not just like short term, not just about COVID, but also looking into other vaccines, other biologicals, basically realizing that there was a very weakness in their countries, but as well at the level of the continent. So that's one thing which will help private companies to be really part of that and invest more, because they see the environment is changing, they see more guarantees. I think the situation is that certain companies, and Mark mentioned BioNTech and Moderna, but what I liked about BioNTech and Moderna is that because they maybe went through themselves through challenges because they decided to venture into vaccine, even though initially they were more focusing on oncology. I think they realized the importance also of building those partnerships and tech transferring it with certain countries. Obviously, they will be selective. I mean, as a pharmaceutical industry, a big pharma, you will select the market where you will go. Well, you will make sure you will see a more less risks. I mean, that was before COVID. That was before the IP waiver. I mean, there was always like that. You know, that there will be some selections processes. But what we see is because of the COVID situation in Africa, is that also companies, external companies, American, European, Chinese companies are also looking to collaborate with African countries and also share know-how, or also help establishing local manufacturing in exchange of market access at the end. That's the win-win relationship, right? They know they can get access to a big market. Africa is high population. So I think that's the other side of the coin that we need to look into, is that it's a continent with a high population and and young population as well. One thing I wanted to add as a strength, because things are changing, because the environment is changing, where there's more opportunities for biotech. We see as well that a number of Africans that were trained outside Africa or even working outside Africa are coming back to the continent. And I think that's something that is a wealth of knowledge and experience, which will come back to the continent, providing obviously that they have opportunities. And we already see that. We see in most of the projects that were mentioned by Simon, there's local Africans that have experience outside in large pharmaceutical companies or in engineering that will come back and support those local projects. So we should not underestimate as well that's the role that the returnees will play in shaping this market, because they will bring the innovation, they also will bring that knowledge. When I left Morocco, when I was young, at that time there was no biotechnology in the country. And that's the reason why I left, right? Because I wanted to pursue that. But now when we see that biotechnology production is happening in the continent, I'm sure many Africans will be interested to join those efforts.
And what about, just thinking about Simon's background a little bit, what about the universities, the researchers? I mean, a lot of the countries have excellent university researchers, et cetera. How do those factor into the equation? Maybe a question for you and then also for Simon.
Sure, yeah, Simon will also be able to add. I think one thing that, again, like going back to the comment I said earlier, I think many Africans maybe left because there was not necessarily the degree that was specialized in biomanufacturing, on biotechnology, right? And that was not necessarily available. Some countries have started to put that into their curriculum. And I think that's the foundation, is to ensure that universities will also include curriculums that is about obviously biological research that was already in place, but also looking at more the industrial part. You know, we need engineers in different fields that will support that biotechnology ramp up, right? And Simon will be able to add a little bit more, because that also part of the continental strategy is to ensure there's also strengthening the workforce from the university level, but also R&D in as such, you know, like ensuring also that there's more innovation that is happening in the continent for endemic diseases, for particular needs that are like very specific to the continent. Simon, please feel free to add on that.
Well, I mean, the African CDC PAVM is really looking at that because, as you know, the diseases that plague us are not necessarily the diseases that plague the West. So capacity for research and development has to be built to enable the continent address the peculiar diseases that are endemic to the continent. And to do that, you need basically the involvement of the universities to continue to do R&D and develop vaccines against the diseases that actually plague us. So if you look at the India model, for example, and that is why advancing and supporting this biomanufacturing on the continent, most of the R&Ds and clinical trials funding in India come from the local biotech companies that are developing their own vaccines. So they spend over $200–300 million every year to conduct clinical trials because the biomanufacturing is now very successful. So governments in Africa may not have that resource, the resources to strengthen the capacity of universities to invest, to conduct clinical trials of, product development that, again, requiring the making the vaccines and the clinical trials. So once the local biomanufacturing capabilities established, and then they become profitable, naturally, they'll begin to support universities and other institutions' R&D efforts.
Yeah, that makes sense. Kind of a mutual direction flow of knowledge and expertise, creating centers of excellence. Any IP, last question, and then maybe we'll do a final thoughts round. But Mark, what are IP considerations that might be relevant to this question of the role of researchers, universities, that kind of thing? You're on mute still.
I apologize. So, businesses, not just in biomanufacturing, but really all sorts of businesses, even businesses that manufacture consumer goods, look at the IP environment of a particular country before they decide whether or how to invest in manufacturing there, distributing there, setting up operations, finding local partners. How they partner is affected by the IP environment. So the greater the confidence you create, the more beneficial investments you get. And there's even been research that's shown that the stronger and more effective the IP environment is, the more likely smaller local manufacturers are likely to benefit. I suppose if you think of it, if you're going into India, for example, and you want to partner with, say, a very large company like Tata, you would probably be comfortable working with them because it's almost like a treaty between two large countries. But if you're choosing smaller companies to work with, then you start being more concerned about the IP environment. So the quality of partnerships goes up and the know-how transfer increases with the confidence in the IP environment. And that's not to say IP is the be all and end all, because you need confidence in the court system, infrastructure, educated workforce. There's so many other things, but IP is just one of those key enablers. You don't want it missing, or your foundation is missing a key piece.
Okay, well, a number of times we've mentioned the pandemic. Maybe a last round of final thoughts. What can we learn from the pandemic? What do we take forward in order to establish the right conditions as different actors in these ecosystems for extending biomanufacturing over the medium and long term, especially in Africa? Let's start with you, Simon.
Well, as we know, AVMI believes that this pandemic has opened our eyes to see the importance of local vaccine manufacturing. We now have to go beyond fill-finish operations to drug substance manufacturing. If not, we may end up with countless filling plants on the continent, but no products that can be filled. Over.
Anissa, what's your thought?
Sure. I wanted to, the last message that I wanted to give is something which we didn't spend too much time, but I think it's important to mention, is that Africa is not going to start and go back like 20 years ago, how biomanufacturing was, right? And start from scratch. So there is the ability for manufacturers and obviously governments to leapfrog and already benefit from most recent technology. And I mean, we could see with the pandemic, mRNA, everybody was saying mRNA is a cutting edge, but mRNA has been around for 20 years. And Africa is not going to wait for another 20 years and can already start with developing mRNA vaccines and other biologics in the continent. So I think the pandemic has stressed the importance to continue to innovate. Whatever country, if it's a high or middle income country, I think technological innovation is key, as well as keeping always agile and those iteration around innovation, and continue to benefit and adopt them as quick as possible. We mentioned mRNA, but Simon mentioned single-use technology. So now we're looking into next generation processing, so what we call the industry of the future, or industry 4.0. And that is something which I think in general, the lesson learned is that we need to be able to benefit from innovation and produce better and faster biologicals. Over.
Thank you. Okay. Mark, any closing thought on lessons from the pandemic that can help us to extend biomanufacturing capacity?
Sure. So I think one key moment in this pandemic, one key contribution of governments were their advanced purchase commitments. Companies needed to know that if they invested in developing vaccines quickly, that they had somebody who promised to buy them. They still didn't completely de-risk the investment, because in many cases, the vaccines, it was required to develop a working vaccine. But if it was developed, the government's promised to purchase it. And that was important, knowing that you wouldn't be rejected in favor of another vaccine that had a couple percentage points more efficacy. However, that was a double-edged sword. The benefit of that was encouraging the development of vaccines. The problem, though, was then those manufacturers, those innovators had made contractual commitments to particular countries that had a claim on the vaccine supply, and thus they had priority. At times, they were vaccinating parts of their population that were at far less risk than unvaccinated people throughout the world. So, what's the solution to that? I think we need to look to policy solutions where we have greater global or regional collaboration, so that there is, that say African countries work together to create a purchasing pool. And thus have more clout. That was, we need to work harder to make these global collaborative efforts work better and have the commitments so that the innovation is encouraged and everybody has equal access.
Well, thanks so much for that, all three of you. And thank you very much for your time, and to all of those who joined us. And we will be posting this video on the BOBAB website, so you can share it with others, along with different articles and other resources provided by the speakers and their organizations. So signing off, thanks so much. Very interesting discussion. And I look forward to seeing all of you in some other forum very soon. Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.